I turned 30 on a Tuesday, which already felt like a quiet kind of insult. Not because of the number itself, but because Tuesdays have no ceremony. They pass without witnesses. No one expects anything meaningful to happen on a Tuesday. That morning, I stood in my childhood kitchen, holding a mug I didn't remember buying, listening to the refrigerator hum like it was trying to fill the silence for me. By noon, I no longer lived there. I didn't know that when I woke up. I thought the worst thing about that day would be the email I'd received the night before, the one that confirmed my position had been eliminated, effective immediately. Corporate language wrapped around a clean cut. No misconduct, no warning, just restructuring. I had read it twice, then once more out loud, as if hearing my own voice might make it less final. It didn't. I was standing at this counter when my mother came in, already dressed, already purposeful. She didn't look at me at first. She wiped the same clean spot on the counter twice. Then she said, "We need to talk." Those words never mean what they pretend to mean. They don't mean conversation. They mean a verdict has already been reached. My father followed her in slower, like he was hoping the extra seconds would change something. He sat down at the table where I used to do homework, where my report cards had been reviewed, where decisions had always been made about me without me. I remember thinking absurdly that the light in the room was too bright for what was coming. "You can't stay here anymore," my mother said. Her voice was steady, not angry, not raised. That was worse. "This situation isn't healthy." I waited. I didn't interrupt. I had learned over the years that silence made people reveal more than arguments ever did. My father cleared his throat. "You're not working, you're not contributing, and you're not a child anymore." I nodded once. I wasn't a child. That part was true. Children are protected by default. Adults are measured by usefulness. "I just lost my job yesterday," I said. My voice sounded distant to my own ears, like it belonged to someone calling in from far away. My mother finally looked at me. There was no cruelty there. That was the problem. There was only assessment. "Exactly," she said. "This isn't the time for you to fall apart. You need to figure things out on your own. Figure things out." Those words floated between us light and deadly. They didn't include time, or money, or a place to sleep. I thought of the birthday cake she had baked for my sister every year, even when my sister claimed she didn't like cake. I thought of the way my father had co-signed her first apartment lease without hesitation. I thought of the word temporary, how it had never applied to me. "I can be out by tonight," I said. That surprised them. I saw it in the way my mother's shoulders relaxed just slightly. Relief is rarely subtle when you're watching for it. "That would be best," she said. There was no hug, no acknowledgement of the day, no mention of turning 30, just logistics. I went upstairs and packed what I could fit into 2 bags. Clothes, my laptop, a framed photo of my grandmother that I hesitated over then took anyway. She had been the only one who ever spoke to me like my presence wasn't conditional. As I zipped the second bag, my phone buzzed. A text from my sister. "Happy birthday. Sorry you're having a rough one. Call me later." I didn't respond. By 6 in the evening, I stood on the front porch with my bags at my feet. My father handed me a folded envelope. "This is some cash," he said, "to help you get started." I took it. It felt lighter than dignity, heavier than pride. "Take care of yourself," my mother said. She meant it, in the way people mean things when they don't intend to be involved. I walked down the driveway without looking back, not because I was strong, because if I did, I wasn't sure I'd keep walking. That night, I slept on the couch of a friend I hadn't spoken to in years. She asked questions I didn't answer. She didn't push. I stared at the ceiling and tried to understand how a life could be dismantled so quickly without anyone raising their voice. In the weeks that followed, the silence from my family became complete. No calls, no check-ins, no accidental messages meant for someone else. It was as if removing me from the house had made me easier to remove from memory. I took contract work, short-term, quiet. I paid my friend rent. I stopped waiting for apologies that were never going to come. What I didn't do was forget, because something had shifted that day. Not in them, in me. I had seen the shape of the rules I had been living under without ever agreeing to them. I had mistaken proximity for love, compliance for belonging. I didn't argue, I didn't beg, I didn't ask for more time. I started planning. 5 years later, when I walked back into that same house, I wasn't carrying bags. I was carrying documents, and they didn't recognize me until it was too late. The first year after I left that house didn't feel dramatic. There was no montage of suffering, no cinematic hunger, no sudden transformation. It was quieter than that, more humiliating, more precise. I learned quickly that being an adult without a safety net isn't a metaphor. It's a math problem you solve every morning before you even get out of bed. Rent, food, transportation, health insurance, dignity. One missed variable and the entire equation collapses. I moved 3 times that first year. From my friend's couch to a sublet with a woman who spoke only when necessary, then to a studio apartment above a nail salon that smelled permanently of acetone and burnt coffee. I didn't complain. Complaints waste energy. I needed every ounce of it. The contract work kept coming, but never steadily. Short-term consulting, quiet projects. Companies that wanted my brain but not my name attached to anything long-term. I was invisible by design, and I accepted that. Visibility had cost me too much already. On my birthday the following year, no one from my family called. That was the day it finally clicked that the silence wasn't accidental. It wasn't awkwardness. It wasn't them giving me space. It was punishment. I had broken an unspoken rule by failing at the wrong time, by not being useful when they expected me to be, by turning 30 without the external proof they could point to and say, "See, we raised her right." I remembered something my mother used to say when I was younger, usually with a smile. Love is about sacrifice. At the time, I thought she meant mutual sacrifice. Now I understood. She meant mine. My sister reached out sporadically. A text here, a forwarded photo there. Family holidays I wasn't invited to framed as updates instead of exclusions. Mom made pot roast. Dad fixed the deck. Everyone's doing well. Hope you are too. I answered politely. Briefly, I never asked questions. What I did instead was work. Not in the way people imagine ambition. I wasn't chasing titles. I wasn't climbing a ladder. I was building a foundation so solid it wouldn't need anyone's permission to exist. I tracked everything. Every dollar earned, every dollar spent. I paid off what little debt I had faster than recommended. I said no to social events that didn't serve a purpose. I said yes to projects that scared me. I learned to read contracts the way some people read faces, looking for the line where generosity ends and leverage begins. It was during a late-night call with a startup founder that the first real shift happened. He was nervous, brilliant but disorganized. He needed help structuring a deal that was falling apart because he didn't understand his own numbers. I walked him through it calmly, methodically. At the end of the call, there was a long pause. "You should be doing this for equity," he said, "not just fees." I laughed, not because it was funny, because it felt absurd to imagine having something long-term again. "I don't do that," I said. "You should," he replied. "You're solving problems people like me don't even know how to articulate." I didn't say yes that night. I thought about it for weeks. I ran the risk models. I looked at failure rates. I imagined explaining it to my parents, then realized I no longer needed to imagine that at all. I said yes on my own terms. That was the beginning, not of revenge, of leverage. Over the next 2 years, I became selective, strategic. I took smaller fees in exchange for stakes. I chose companies with unglamorous problems and strong fundamentals. Infrastructure, logistics, systems people ignored because they weren't flashy. I didn't tell anyone in my family. They didn't ask. At Thanksgiving, my sister sent a photo of the table. 12 place settings. My seat replaced by a centerpiece. I stared at it longer than I should have, then put my phone face down and went back to my laptop. There is a particular kind of clarity that comes when you realize no one is coming to save you. It strips away fantasy. It sharpens decision-making. It teaches you the difference between loneliness and freedom. By the 3rd year, my income stabilized. By the 4th, it multiplied. By the 5th, I incorporated. The night I signed the papers, I didn't celebrate. I sat alone in my apartment, the city humming outside, and thought about the girl who had walked down that driveway with 2 bags and no plan beyond survival. I hadn't become hard, I had become precise. What I didn't know yet was that my parents were struggling, not financially at first, structurally. My father's health had begun to decline. Subtle things, missed appointments, forgotten details. My mother took over more, and in doing so, revealed how much of their stability had relied on routines rather than resilience. The house needed repairs, big ones. The neighborhood had changed, property taxes climbed, the margin for error narrowed. They didn't tell me any of this. I heard it through a mutual acquaintance delivered casually, almost carelessly, as if it meant nothing. "Your parents might sell the house," she said. "Seems like a lot for them now." I thanked her and changed the subject. That night I pulled the property records. And for the first time in 5 years, I looked at my childhood home not as a place I had lost, but as an asset with a timeline. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt inevitability. And I understood with unsettling calm that the day would come when our paths crossed again. Not because of forgiveness, but because of paper. The 5th year didn't announce itself with fireworks. It arrived the way real turning points usually do, quietly wrapped in routine. By then, my days were structured with an almost clinical efficiency. Mornings started early, not out of discipline, but because my mind woke before my body. There were too many moving parts now to afford drifting. I had moved again, this time by choice. The apartment overlooked a river that reflected the city lights at night, distorted and honest at the same time. I liked that view. It reminded me that clarity doesn't mean perfection. It means seeing things as they are. My company was still small on paper, lean, purposefully unassuming. We didn't chase headlines. We didn't court attention. We acquired quietly, merged patiently, and exited without ceremony. Money accumulated the way pressure does, underground, slowly, invisibly, until it didn't. People had started calling me cautious, conservative, risk-averse. I let them think that. The truth was simpler. I had already experienced the most destabilizing loss of my life at a kitchen table. Everything after that was manageable. The first message from my mother came in early spring. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even personal. It was a question disguised as politeness. "How are you doing these days?" I stared at it longer than necessary, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew exactly what not to say. I replied with one sentence, "I'm well. Hope you are too." That was enough to open the door. Over the next few months, the messages became more frequent. Updates, complaints framed as observations. "Your father's been tired lately. The house needs work. Things are just different now." She never asked for help, not directly. She didn't have to. The implication hung in the negative space of her words. My sister followed a similar pattern. Casual calls, nostalgic references. "Remember when you used to sit on the porch and read all afternoon?" She laughed when she said it, as if it were a harmless memory and not evidence. I listened. I didn't offer anything. Not money, not advice, not reassurance. Silence, I had learned, was not absence. It was a boundary. Then came the lawyer. He didn't call me. He emailed. Professional, neutral. He represented my parents in a matter related to estate planning and wanted to confirm my contact information for record-keeping purposes. I read the email twice. There it was, the mechanism, the paperwork version of affection. I replied with my assistant's address and nothing else. The documents arrived a week later. Copies, not originals. I wasn't invited to discuss. I was informed. I was included in the way regulations include footnotes. My name appeared exactly once. Excluded. No drama, no justification, just a clean omission wrapped in legal language. My sister named as primary beneficiary. Provisions for contingencies, nothing for me. I didn't feel angry. Anger requires surprise. What I felt was something closer to confirmation. That night, I poured a glass of wine I didn't finish and sat at my desk, the papers spread out in front of me like a map I had already memorized. They hadn't changed. They had simply continued. I called my lawyer the next morning. Not to contest anything, not to threaten, to ask questions. What would happen if they sold the house? Who had power of attorney? What obligations existed if medical decisions became urgent? How were assets structured? My lawyer answered calmly, factually, without judgment. When we hung up, I stared out the window and let the weight of what I knew settle into place. The house was the keystone, emotionally for them, financially for everyone. And they were running out of options. A month later, the listing went live. They didn't tell me. I found it the way investors find opportunity, through alerts, through data, through patterns. The photos were flattering but honest. Wear at the edges, deferred maintenance hidden under staging, a price that suggested hope more than reality. I recognized the dining room immediately. The angle gave away the table, the one where decisions had always been made about me. I forwarded the listing to my acquisitions team with a single line: quiet interest, no outreach yet. They asked no questions. Weeks passed, no offers, then one, then it fell through. That was when my mother called. Her voice was softer than I remembered, not weak, careful, as if she were navigating unfamiliar terrain without a map. "We're thinking of downsizing," she said. "It just makes sense at this stage." I waited. "It's been challenging," she added. "Things don't work the way they used to." I pictured her standing in that kitchen, the same light, the same counter. I wondered if she remembered telling me to figure things out on my own. "I understand," I said. There was a pause. She was waiting for something, an offer, a reassurance, a signal that I was still available to be leaned on. I didn't give it. What I gave instead was space. 3 weeks later, an offer came in. Mine. Not under my name, not directly, through a holding company that had no emotional history with that address. It was clean, competitive, slightly under asking, justified by inspection contingencies. They accepted within 48 hours. I found out through the closing schedule, not the family group chat. The final document I signed that day wasn't the purchase agreement. It was the one transferring ownership into my personal trust. I sat back after signing, my hands steady, my breath even. This wasn't revenge yet. This was alignment. The last thing I did before closing my laptop was write myself a note. Do not announce, let them discover. Because some truths are more powerful when they arrive without warning. And I knew with absolute certainty that when they did, there would be no argument. Only realization. And that was always the point. The closing date was set for a Thursday morning in early autumn. Clear weather, predictable traffic, everything about it felt intentionally ordinary, which I appreciated. Life-changing moments rarely announce themselves. They blend in. They wait until you're not looking. I didn't attend the closing in person. There was no reason to. My attorney handled it. My signature was already in place. Funds had been wired days earlier. The transaction was clean, quiet, and final. My parents packed the house over the course of 2 weeks. I know this because my sister told me. She called under the pretense of nostalgia, her voice full of carefully curated warmth. "Mom's been overwhelmed," she said. "It's hard letting go of a place like that. You know how much history is there." I did know. I also knew that history only mattered when it served a purpose. "I hope the move goes smoothly," I said. She waited. I could hear it in the silence. She was used to conversations where I filled gaps, softened edges, offered myself as emotional labor. When I didn't, she tried a different approach. "It might be good for you to come by," she said. "Just to say goodbye." I pictured myself standing in rooms that had taught me conditional belonging. I pictured the way my mother's eyes would scan me, assessing, comparing. I pictured my father's quiet discomfort. "No," I said gently. "I don't think that would be helpful." "For who?" she asked. "For me," I replied. She didn't argue. She didn't have to. The call ended shortly after. On the day they moved out, I was in a meeting discussing a potential acquisition in another state. The numbers were solid, the risks manageable, the decision clear. Halfway through, my phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "We're officially out of the house today." There was a photo attached. The living room empty. Sunlight cutting across the floor where the couch used to be. The walls bare, neutral, stripped of narrative. I stared at it longer than I expected to. I typed several responses, deleted all of them. I settled on one sentence. "I hope the transition is peaceful." It was true. The next phase began the following Monday. I drove to the house alone. I parked across the street at first, watching from a distance like an outsider. The lawn had grown uneven. The mailbox leaned slightly to the left. The place looked smaller than it did in my memory. Keys in hand, I crossed the street and unlocked the front door. The sound was unmistakable, the click of ownership. Inside, the air was stale, a mix of dust and something older. I stepped in slowly, not out of reverence, but out of observation. I wasn't revisiting memories, I was auditing space. The dining room was exactly as I remembered. Same light fixture, same proportions. The table was gone, but I could see it anyway. The place where I had been told to leave. The place where my usefulness had been evaluated and found lacking. I didn't sit down. I walked through every room, methodically noting what needed work. Structural issues, plumbing, electrical, cosmetic changes. I took photos. I made notes. I didn't rush. This wasn't about reclaiming, it was about control. 2 days later, my parents asked if they could stop by. They had forgotten a box, my mother said. Some papers, family documents. I considered it, not emotionally, logistically. Yes, I said, Thursday afternoon. They arrived together. I watched them through the window as they stood on the porch waiting. They looked older than I remembered. Not fragile, just less certain. As if the ground beneath them had shifted and they hadn't yet adjusted their balance. I opened the door. My mother stepped inside first, already mid-sentence. Thank you for letting us. She stopped. Her eyes moved past me, over my shoulder into the house. My father followed slower. He saw it too. The emptiness. The changes already underway. The absence of their things. Then their eyes came back to me. There was a moment where everything aligned. The house, the silence, my posture, the realization taking shape. What's going on, my mother asked. I bought the house, I said. The words landed cleanly. No emphasis, no inflection. My father blinked. Once, twice. What do you mean you bought it? I mean, I'm the owner, I replied. The sale closed last week. My mother's face tightened, not with anger, but with something closer to disorientation. That's not funny. I'm not joking. She looked around again as if the walls might contradict me. They didn't. But we sold it, she said slowly. We sold it to a company. Yes, I said, mine. There it was. The break. The point where the story they had been telling themselves could no longer hold. My sister arrived 10 minutes later, summoned by panic. She walked in already defensive, already prepared to manage something. What did you do? She asked. I made an offer, I said. They accepted. You didn't think to tell us, she demanded. I met her gaze. You didn't think to tell me when you cut me out of the will. That landed differently. My father sat down heavily on the stairs. My mother spoke, her voice sharp now. This is vindictive. No, I said, this is business. I walked to the dining room and stood where the table used to be. You told me to figure things out on my own, I continued. I did. No one spoke. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't list grievances, I didn't recount pain, I didn't need to. The power shift was complete. I'll have the documents for the box you mentioned, I said. Anything personal you left behind can be retrieved by appointment. Appointment, my sister repeated, incredulous. Yes, I said, boundaries. They left shortly after. I didn't watch them go. I locked the door behind them and stood in the quiet, not triumphant, not relieved. Just steady, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't standing in their house. They were standing in mine, and that changed everything. After they left, I didn't sit down. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I walked through the house again, slower this time, noticing how silence behaves differently when it belongs to you. It doesn't press in. It waits. I closed the dining room door and stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Not because I needed closure, but because I wanted to remember how it felt to stand in a place where I no longer needed permission to exist. Then I got back to work. Control. I've learned isn't about dramatic gestures. It's about follow-through. Paper trails, calendars, decisions that don't require consensus. The next morning, I sent 3 emails. One to my property manager, one to my lawyer, one to a contractor I trusted. Each was brief. Each moved something forward. By the end of the week, the locks had been changed, utilities transferred, insurance updated. The house was officially operationally mine. That was when the messages started. My mother first. Long paragraphs. A mix of confusion and accusation. How could you do this without telling us we're your parents? We didn't raise you to be so cold. I read it once. I didn't respond. My sister followed. Shorter, sharper. This is humiliating. People are talking. You could have handled this with more compassion. I put the phone face down and let the screen go dark. Compassion in my family had always meant compliance. A week later, my father called. I answered. He didn't waste time. Your mother hasn't been sleeping, he said. This has been very hard on her. I listened. He had always been the messenger, the buffer, the one who carried emotional weight without ever deciding where it went. I'm sorry to hear that, I said. You didn't have to do it this way, he continued. You could have helped us without this, without what I wondered, without them knowing where the help came from, without feeling the consequences of their choices. This way was the only way that didn't put me back in the same position, I said. I'm not willing to do that anymore. He sighed. We're family. Yes, I said. And families still need contracts. There was silence on the line, not anger, something closer to defeat. I'll have the documents you asked about, I added. Your box will be ready next Tuesday. When we hung up, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt finished. The renovations began quietly. Necessary updates, nothing extravagant. I didn't want to erase the house. I wanted to neutralize it. Walls repainted, floors refinished, fixtures replaced. The physical version of setting boundaries. During that time, I learned things I hadn't known. My mother had resisted selling longer than my father wanted. My sister had been counting on an inheritance she had already mentally spent. The house wasn't just a home, it was a plan. And now it wasn't theirs. My sister showed up unannounced one afternoon while contractors were working. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes scanning the changes like they were personal insults. "You've turned it into an investment," she said. "No," I replied. "I turned it into property." She scoffed. "You always were like this, distant, calculating." I looked at her, really looked. The familiar confidence, the expectation of deference. "You never noticed because I was quiet," I said, "not because I wasn't paying attention." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "So what now? You going to rent it back to them? Make them beg." "No," I said. "They already moved." Her expression shifted, confusion first, then realization. "You didn't buy it for them," she said. "I bought it for me." She shook her head. "This is petty." "No," I said again. "This is final." She left without another word. That night, I sat in my apartment, the river reflecting a city that no longer intimidated me. I thought about revenge, not as a feeling, as a structure. Revenge when done poorly is loud, emotional, short-lived. Revenge when done well is quiet, durable. It doesn't announce itself. It simply rearranges the future. I hadn't taken anything from them. I had stopped giving. The final message came from my mother a few days later. "You've changed." I typed back 2 words. I grew. There was no reply. In the weeks that followed, my life didn't explode into satisfaction. It settled. The way things do when they finally fit. But I knew this wasn't the end, because power once shifted rarely stays uncontested. And my family was just beginning to understand what it meant to live without access to me. The next move wouldn't be mine. It would be theirs. And when it came, I intended to be ready. The first real pushback came in the form of politeness. It arrived as an invitation, not to dinner, not to reconcile, to talk. My mother framed it as concern. My father framed it as practicality. My sister framed it as necessity. 3 different voices, one shared objective. "We need to discuss arrangements." I let the message sit for 2 days before responding. "I agree to meet. My attorney will be present." That changed the tone immediately. The meeting took place in a neutral office downtown. Glass walls, soft chairs, water offered but untouched. My parents arrived early. I arrived on time. My sister arrived late, breathless, already irritated by the imbalance. No one hugged. The lawyer began with formalities. Then my mother spoke. "This situation has put us in a difficult position," she said, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "We didn't anticipate complications." I waited. My father leaned forward. "We need access to some of the items still in the house, and we need clarity about what you intend to do with it." "I intend to hold it," I said. "For now." "For now," my sister repeated. "That's vague." "It's accurate." She rolled her eyes. "You can't just sit on it forever." "I can," I said, "and I might." The lawyer cleared his throat, a gentle reminder of structure. My mother's voice sharpened. "This isn't how families behave." I met her gaze evenly. "This is how people behave when agreements matter." She inhaled sharply. "So that's it. You're punishing us." "No," I said. "I'm protecting myself." Silence. My father spoke again, softer. "We assumed, given everything, that you would help if things got hard. I thought of the day I lost my job, the kitchen, the verdict." "You assumed wrong," I said. The lawyer interjected, outlining the legal boundaries. Access by appointment, retrieval only, no residency, no financial obligations. My sister slammed her hand on the arm of her chair. "This is ridiculous. You're holding a house hostage to prove a point." I looked at her calmly. "The point was proven 5 years ago. This is the result." The meeting ended without resolution. No agreement reached, no concessions made. That was when they changed tactics. 2 weeks later, I received a notice. A legal filing, contesting the sale. Not on financial grounds, on emotional ones. Undue influence, misrepresentation, vulnerability. I read it carefully, then handed it to my lawyer without comment. He smiled slightly. "This won't go anywhere." "I know," I said, "but they need to try." The court date was set 3 months out. In that time, my mother began calling extended family, rewriting the narrative. I was cold, ungrateful, calculating. She cried easily, publicly. I didn't respond. I didn't defend myself. I let the facts exist. On the day of the hearing, I wore a simple suit and no jewelry. I sat quietly. I listened. Their lawyer spoke of emotional harm, of betrayal, of a daughter who used success to humiliate her parents. When it was my turn, I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't perform. I made an offer, I said. It was accepted. I complied with every legal requirement. I disclosed nothing because I was not required to. This was a standard transaction. The judge nodded. My lawyer presented the timeline, the emails, the disclosures, the signatures. The decision was swift. Case dismissed. Outside the courtroom, my mother cried. My sister glared. My father looked tired. I didn't approach them. I walked out, the sound of my heels steady on the floor. That night, I slept deeply. The next morning, I received a message from my sister. "You've made your point. What do you want now?" I stared at the screen, then typed my response. Distance. That was when I understood something I hadn't before. Revenge wasn't the house. It was the boundary they could no longer cross. And that boundary was about to be tested in ways none of us had anticipated. Because loss has a way of exposing truths people have spent decades hiding. And my family was about to lose more than a building. They were about to lose the story they told themselves about who they were, and who I was supposed to be. The distance I asked for didn't arrive quietly. It never does when people are used to access. When silence becomes intentional, it feels like an attack to those who've benefited from it being absent. My parents stopped calling. My sister didn't. She tried a new tone. Casual, almost friendly. Messages about work stress, about aging parents, about how complicated life gets when everyone's tired. She spoke as if we were allies navigating a shared burden, not participants in a fracture she had helped create. I didn't engage. What I did instead was shift my attention to something I had ignored for too long. My grandmother's trust. She had passed away years earlier quietly, the way some people leave without ever taking up space. At the time, I had been told everything was settled, simple, nothing to worry about. I hadn't questioned it then. I hadn't known how. Now I did. I asked my lawyer to pull the records. The trust was modest by market standards, but emotionally significant. It had been established with clear intent: educational support, emergency provisions, equal consideration for grandchildren. The distribution, however, told a different story. My sister had received disbursements I hadn't known about: tuition assistance, a down payment, living expenses during a period when she hadn't been working. My portion had been deferred, then quietly absorbed. There was a clause, ambiguous, activated only under certain conditions. Conditions that had been interpreted by my mother as guardianship rather than stewardship. It wasn't illegal. It was convenient. I sat with that knowledge longer than I expected to. Not angry, just steady. This wasn't about money, it was about pattern. The same pattern that had justified pushing me out. The same pattern that had framed my independence as disloyalty. I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. "We need to talk about Grandma's trust," I said. Her breath caught just slightly. "There's nothing to discuss," she replied. "Everything was handled appropriately." "Then you won't mind if my lawyer reviews it." Silence. "That trust was meant to help you when you needed it," she said carefully. "You were always capable." There it was. Capability as disqualification. "I needed it," I said. "You decided I didn't." "That's not fair," she snapped. "I'm not asking for fairness," I replied. "I'm asking for documentation." She hung up. 2 days later, my lawyer confirmed what we both suspected. The trust had been mismanaged, not criminally, strategically, in a way that assumed I would never challenge it. We had options. We could pursue restitution, force a review, expose decisions made without consent. I chose a different path. I sent a letter, not a threat, not a demand, a notice of intent. It outlined the discrepancies, the potential outcomes, the legal costs involved if it escalated. It ended with a sentence that mattered: "I'm willing to resolve this quietly." The response came within 24 hours. A request to meet. This time my sister didn't attend. My parents sat across from me, smaller somehow. Not diminished, just revealed. My mother spoke first. We did what we thought was best. For who, I asked. She didn't answer. My father cleared his throat. "What do you want?" I looked at him, at both of them. "I want acknowledgement," I said. "In writing. I want the record corrected, and I want the remaining assets transferred as originally intended." My mother's eyes filled. "You're tearing this family apart." "No," I said. "I'm documenting it." They agreed. The transfer took place 2 weeks later. No apologies, no reconciliation, just compliance. That night, I sat alone with a glass of water and thought about inheritance. Not as money, as permission. They had assumed I didn't need it because I survived without it. They had never considered that surviving wasn't the same as being supported. The trust wasn't life-changing. The acknowledgement was, because for the first time there was a paper trail that said I had been owed something, and that it had been withheld. I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't need to. The balance of power had shifted again, and this time it wasn't about property or contracts. It was about truth, the kind that can't be argued away, the kind that lingers. And I knew with a certainty that surprised me that the final reckoning wouldn't come from me at all. It would come from what they could no longer deny, and what they could no longer control. Truth has a way of spreading without being announced. It doesn't arrive as a confrontation. It leaks. Through tone changes, through omissions, through the subtle recalibration of how people speak when they realize the old version of the story no longer holds. After the trust issue was resolved, my parents grew cautious. Conversations became formal, messages shorter. They no longer assumed access to my time or my emotions. They asked before calling. They waited for replies. What they didn't do was apologize. I didn't need them to. Apologies can be strategic. Accountability is harder to fake. The shift became visible to others before it did to them. Extended family started reaching out. Questions disguised as concern. I answered politely, selectively. I didn't correct narratives unless necessary. I let inconsistencies do their work. At a holiday gathering, I didn't attend. My absence was noticed differently, no longer as a sulk, as a statement. I heard about it from a cousin who had always watched quietly from the edges. "Things feel tense," she said. "People don't know what to say anymore." That was the cost of transparency. Meanwhile, my life continued to expand in directions that had nothing to do with them. The company grew, not explosively, intentionally. We acquired a mid-sized logistics firm that filled a gap in our infrastructure portfolio. The deal closed smoothly. I was named chair not because I demanded it, but because it made sense. For the first time, I allowed myself to be visible. I attended industry events, spoke on panels, not as a prodigy, as a practitioner. Someone who had built something quietly and knew exactly how fragile it was. Articles followed, interviews. My name appeared in places my parents read. They didn't mention it. I knew they saw it. The first crack came through my father. He called one evening, his voice unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with age. "I didn't know," he said. "Know what I asked? How much you were doing, what you built?" I waited. "We underestimated you," he continued. "Your mother and we thought we were protecting the family. By controlling it," I said. He didn't argue. The call ended without resolution. A week later, my mother asked to meet alone. No lawyers, no agendas, just coffee. I agreed. She chose a quiet cafe near her new apartment. Smaller than the house had been, more contained. She looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "I don't recognize you anymore." I smiled faintly. "You never really did." Her mouth tightened. "That's not fair." "It's accurate," I said. She took a breath. "You didn't need to humiliate us." "I didn't," I replied. "You felt humiliated because you lost control." She stared into her cup. "We did what we thought was right." "I know," I said. "That's what made it dangerous." She looked up sharply. "Love without boundaries becomes entitlement," I continued. "And entitlement always asks for more." She didn't respond. We sat there in silence, the hum of other conversations filling the space where ours used to dominate. "I'm tired," she said finally. "I don't want to fight anymore." "I'm not fighting," I said. "I'm finished." She nodded slowly, as if absorbing a truth she hadn't known how to articulate. When we stood to leave, she hesitated. "Will you ever forgive us?" I considered the question carefully. "I forgave myself," I said. "That's the part that mattered." She didn't reach for me. I didn't offer. We walked out separately. That night I thought about endings. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet ones that come when a story no longer needs your participation. But even then, something unresolved lingered. Because while my parents were adjusting to a new reality, my sister was not. She had been silent for weeks, too silent. And I had learned the hard way that silence from someone like her was never peace. It was preparation. I didn't know what she was planning, only that it would come dressed as necessity. And that when it did, it would test whether the boundaries I had built could hold. The real final act, I realized, wasn't about revenge. It was about refusal. And that was something my sister had never learned to accept. My sister resurfaced the way she always did when she wanted something indirectly. Not with a call, not with a message, with a crisis she made sure I would hear about. It started with a voicemail from an unfamiliar number. A woman introducing herself as a financial advisor. Polite, concerned. She referenced my sister's name and a matter involving family-held assets. I didn't return the call. 2 days later, my father called. She's in trouble, he said without preamble. I waited. She made some decisions, he continued. Assumptions, really. About what would be available. Available to her, I said. He didn't correct me. The picture came together quickly. My sister had leveraged expectations. Loans based on projected inheritance. Lifestyle sustained by a future she assumed was guaranteed. Now that future had changed. She needs help, my father said, just temporarily. There it was. The ask they wouldn't name. I'm not the solution to decisions I didn't make, I said. She's your sister. Yes, I replied, and she's an adult. He sighed heavily. Your mother is worried sick. I imagine she is, I said. So was I when I had nowhere to go. He didn't respond. That night my sister finally called. She skipped pleasantries. I need a bridge, she said, just until things stabilize. Define stabilize, I asked. She exhaled sharply. You don't have to do this. I'm not doing anything, I replied. You're asking. After everything, you're really going to turn your back on me, she snapped. I thought about the trust, the house, the will. I'm not turning my back, I said. I'm standing still. You have the means, she pressed. You could fix this. I agreed, and then what? Silence. You've never said no to me like this, she said finally. That's true, I replied. And look where it got us. She hung up. The next move came faster than I expected. A letter from her attorney. A demand framed as entitlement. Claims of moral obligation. References to shared history. I forwarded it to my lawyer without comment. His response was immediate. She doesn't have a case. I know, I said, but she needs one. We prepared a response. Calm, precise, firm. No financial support would be provided. No involvement. No negotiation. 2 weeks later, my sister filed for bankruptcy. It wasn't dramatic, it was procedural, notices sent, accounts frozen, assets liquidated. My parents were humiliated. Not publicly, privately. The kind of humiliation that doesn't come from exposure, but from realization. They had built a system where one child was buffered from consequence and the other was forced to adapt. And now the one they had protected couldn't survive without protection. I attended none of the discussions that followed. I didn't offer commentary. I didn't gloat. I watched from a distance as dynamics rearranged themselves without my input. My mother stopped calling entirely. My father called once weeks later. We should have prepared her better, he said quietly. Yes, I replied. That was all. In the aftermath, something unexpected happened. Relief! Not the sharp kind. The deep kind that comes when a role you never asked for is finally released. I wasn't the fixer anymore. I wasn't the backup plan. I wasn't the responsible one expected to compensate for everyone else's choices. I was just myself. A few days later, I received an email from the logistics firm we had acquired months earlier. A new expansion opportunity. High risk, high reward. I said yes without hesitation. Because I had learned the difference between calculated risk and emotional debt. One builds futures, the other drains them. The final message from my sister came late one night. I didn't expect this to happen. I stared at the screen, then typed a reply I had rehearsed long before she ever needed it. Neither did I. I didn't send anything else, because some lessons can't be taught. They have to be lived. And as I closed my laptop and looked out at the city lights, I understood something with absolute clarity. The story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about consequence. And for the first time, those consequences were finally distributed fairly. The silence that followed my sister's collapse was different from the ones before it. It wasn't tactical, it wasn't performative. It was exhausted. No one was trying to persuade me anymore. My parents didn't call. They didn't text. They didn't send updates disguised as concern. Weeks passed, then months. For the first time in my life, their absence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like acceptance. Not the warm kind, the resigned kind. The kind that comes when people finally understand that the rules have changed and there's no appeal process left. I focused on work. The expansion opportunity turned into a full acquisition. Complicated, international. The kind of deal that collapses if egos get involved. I kept mine out of it. I listened more than I spoke. I asked questions that made people uncomfortable because they exposed assumptions no one wanted examined. The deal closed ahead of schedule. That was when someone suggested a profile piece, a long-form article, not about success, about trajectory. I hesitated. Visibility had never been my goal. It still wasn't. But I had learned that silence, when it's the only option, is different from silence chosen deliberately. I agreed with conditions. No family interviews. No personal framing beyond what I approved. No narrative about redemption. Just facts. The article ran on a Sunday morning. I didn't share it. I didn't need to. My phone lit up anyway. Old colleagues, former clients, people who had underestimated me once and now needed to recalibrate. And then finally my mother. I let it ring. When I called her back later that evening, her voice sounded smaller. Not fragile, just stripped of authority. I read it, she said. I assumed you would, I replied. I didn't know, she said again. The phrase had become familiar. A refrain. I know, I said. She paused. You never needed us, did you? The question wasn't self-pitying. It was curious, almost respectful. I needed parents, I said, not managers. She didn't respond. I think she said slowly we were afraid. Of what I asked. She exhaled, of losing you. I closed my eyes. You lost me when you tried to own me, I said. The truth didn't land with force. It didn't need to. It just existed. We talked for another few minutes. About logistics, about health, about nothing that mattered and everything that had already passed. When we hung up, I felt something loosen. Not forgiveness. Finality. A week later, I received a letter in the mail. Handwritten, from my father. He didn't apologize, he didn't justify, he acknowledged. You were stronger than we knew how to handle. We mistook control for care. I see that now. It wasn't enough to erase the past. It was enough to stop reliving it. I placed the letter in a drawer and didn't reread it. At work, I made a decision that surprised people. I stepped back. Not out of burnout, out of clarity. I appointed a new CEO, younger, sharp, unburdened by the need to prove anything to anyone. I kept my seat as chair. Power, I had learned, is most effective when it doesn't need constant reinforcement. The house sold again that year. Not to my parents, not to anyone connected to my past. I let it go. Some places are meant to be owned only long enough to prove a point. On the day the sale finalized, I stood in the empty living room one last time. I didn't see memories anymore. I saw a closed chapter. As I locked the door for the final time, I realized something quietly profound. I hadn't won. I had exited. And that for me was the real victory. Because winning still implies opposition. Exiting means freedom. The story was almost over. There was just one thing left to say. One final truth I had earned the right to articulate, and I would do it on my own terms. After the house sold, my life entered a phase that felt unfamiliar precisely because it lacked tension. No waiting for the next message. No bracing for the next request. No preparing for conversations designed to reposition me back into an old role. At first, the quiet made me uneasy. Trauma teaches you to stay alert even when the threat is gone. I caught myself checking my phone reflexively, anticipating a crisis that never arrived. When nothing happened, I realized how much of my adulthood had been spent managing other people's expectations instead of my own nervous system. So I changed the rhythm. I stopped packing my days edge to edge. I took meetings later. I walked in the mornings without headphones. I learned what my thoughts sounded like when they weren't responding to pressure. What surprised me most was how little anger remained. Not because it had been resolved, because it had been exhausted. Anger requires engagement. I had disengaged. My parents adjusted in their own way. My father sent occasional updates, neutral, informational, as if he were learning how to communicate without agenda. My mother stayed distant, not hostile, just careful. I understood that too. Distance was new for her. It took practice. My sister disappeared entirely. No calls, no messages, no indirect reach-throughs via relatives. I heard fragments through the family network. A smaller apartment. A job that didn't match her degree. A life recalibrated downward. For the first time, no one asked me to intervene. They had learned. The irony wasn't lost on me. The child they had deemed incapable had become the only one who didn't need rescuing. Work continued, but differently. I no longer chased expansion for its own sake. I chose projects that aligned with my tolerance for complexity. I mentored younger women who reminded me of myself before I learned that competence without boundaries invites exploitation. I never told them what to do. I asked better questions. One afternoon, after a panel discussion, a woman in her early 30s pulled me aside. How did you know when to stop trying to earn their approval, she asked. I thought about it. I didn't stop trying, I said. I stopped believing it was owed. She nodded like something had clicked. That night, I wrote for the first time about my family. Not to publish, not to process, just to document. I wrote about the birthday, the kitchen, the envelope of cash, the driveway. I wrote about the house, the trust, the courtroom. Not with bitterness, with precision. When I finished, I didn't feel lighter. I felt clear. The following week, my mother called unexpectedly. "I've been thinking," she said, "about everything." I listened. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted. I appreciated the honesty. "There isn't a fix," I said. "There's just adjustment." She was quiet. "I miss you," she said finally. "I know," I replied. It was the truest answer I could give. We didn't make plans. We didn't promise anything. We acknowledged reality. When the call ended, I didn't feel pulled backward. I felt complete. That was when I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to articulate before. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for validation. Not for repair. Not for justice. Justice had already happened. Quietly, thoroughly. All that remained was meaning. And meaning I had learned isn't given. It's chosen. There was one final chapter left. Not of conflict. Of ownership. Not of property. Of self. And it was time to say it out loud. I'm telling this story now not because it still hurts, but because it no longer does. That distinction matters. Pain asks for witnesses. Healing doesn't. Healing asks for truth stated plainly without embellishment or apology. For a long time, I believed my life had been shaped by a single act of rejection. Being told to leave. Being deemed unnecessary. Being treated as a liability the moment I stopped performing stability for other people's comfort. But that wasn't the defining moment. The defining moment came later when I understood that what I had lost wasn't love. It was access. And access, when mistaken for affection, can hollow a person out. I used to replay that birthday in my head. The kitchen, the tone, the way the decision had already been made before the conversation began. I wondered what I could have done differently. How I might have stayed. Now I understand that staying would have cost me far more than leaving ever did. Because the moment I walked down that driveway, I stopped negotiating my worth. Everything that followed grew from that. The work, the company, the house, the documents, the boundaries. People like to call that revenge. I don't. Revenge requires obsession. What I practiced was detachment. I didn't succeed to prove them wrong. I succeeded because I had nothing left to prove. The irony is that once I stopped orienting my life around their approval, I became everything they said I wasn't ready to be. Capable, stable, decisive. Not because I hardened, but because I stopped waiting. Waiting for permission, waiting for reassurance, waiting for someone to say, "Now you're allowed to take up space." No one ever says that. You either take it or you disappear quietly trying to earn it. My parents didn't lose a daughter because I bought a house or enforced a boundary. They lost the version of me that would have continued absorbing discomfort to preserve their narrative. That version was unsustainable. My sister didn't lose support because I said no. She lost the illusion that consequences could always be outsourced. And I didn't lose a family. I lost an arrangement that only worked when I was smaller than my potential. What surprised me most wasn't how far I went. It was how little it took once I stopped explaining myself. A signature, a refusal, a closed door. People think power looks like confrontation. It doesn't. Power looks like not showing up to conversations designed to reduce you. It looks like reading the fine print. It looks like choosing silence when you're being baited into justification. It looks like walking away without slamming the door. Today my life is quieter than it's ever been. Not empty. Intentional. I choose who has access to me. I choose what I build. I choose when I rest. I no longer confuse longevity with loyalty. I no longer mistake obligation for love. And I no longer shrink to preserve someone else's comfort. If there's a lesson here, it isn't about revenge or success or money. It's about boundaries. About understanding that family can be a source of strength, but it is not exempt from accountability. That being grateful doesn't mean being compliant. That choosing yourself isn't selfish when the alternative is erasure. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is stop participating in dynamics that require your silence to function. Sometimes the bravest act isn't confrontation. It's refusal. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own life in mine, I want you to know something important. You don't need a dramatic exit. You don't need a perfect plan. You don't need to be certain. You only need to be done. Done explaining. Done justifying. Done hoping that people who benefit from your compliance will suddenly reward it with respect. They won't, but you can. And when you do, the world doesn't end. It opens. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived a version of it or watched someone you love disappear inside a family that never learned where love ends and control begins, you're not alone. Stay. Listen, share your story. And remember this, you don't owe anyone access to you, not even the people who taught you to doubt that truth in the first place.